Good morning, everyone here in person and everyone on Zoom that is joining us today. And welcome to Chesterland UCC. And as we say every week here, wherever you are on life's journey, you are absolutely welcome in this place. It doesn't matter how you dress, where you live, whom you love. You are absolutely welcome here as you are. Let's move into our moment of focus. And today's moment of focus, and I've used this one before, you might recognize it, but not only is it appropriate for this message, John Caputo is actually one of my favorite theologians, so I'm always a big fan of his writings, but it's from his book, It Spooks, Living in Response to an Unheard Call. There's nothing riskier than having commerce with the unknown, the unexpected, the unforeseen, with calling for the coming of what we cannot see coming. God's audacity is to throw the responsibility for God becoming God, on us, which is the height of audacity. The name God is the name of a call to which we are supposed to be the response. Without that response, the name is a dead letter. The real death of God is to ignore the call.
Was a traveler set on by thieves who beat him and left him to die. A priest and a Levite each saw him in pain, and they turned away and walked by. Yes, they turned away and walked by. A certain Samaritan then came along He took him to stay at the inn until well, and for all the service he paid. Yes, for all the service he paid. I know who's my neighbor and whom I should love, for whom I should do a good deed. Who has a need? Yes, anyone who has a need.
Today, as I mentioned, is the first Sunday of the month, which means that today we join together in the act of communion. If you do not have your communion snack pack, they're over here in the basket, or you can raise your hand. Someone can get one to you if you need one. But also, if you need help opening them, they can be a little fidgety to open. If you need help, please raise your hand. And as you are doing that, as you're getting them open, remember that the divine Spirit seeks to be in communion with us, but similarly, there is an expectation that we remain and be in communion with one another. Community. That's the name of what we're doing right now. Communion. Community. And because God, as we'll talk about in today's message, God emerges out of our communal relationships and our dynamics. And that should challenge us to continue to be a beacon for others around us. So by the way of this sacrament of communion, we affirm that we are committed to the divine way of love and peace through our motives, through our thoughts, through our actions, and I think most importantly, through our practices in this world. And also through this act of communion, we seek to enflesh, to give flesh to hope and love in our lives, and to realize and to accept the fullness of God among us. All are invited to this table of reconciliation, we exclude nobody. However, there are also no expectations that you participate if you are not feeling led to do so. In other words, don't feel pressured to do communion if you just aren't feeling it, or you don't want to, or you're not comfortable doing it. But in coming together, let us recognize our responsibility in living in love and peace with one another and all of creation, so as to be joined together as one sacramental communion of body and spirit throughout the earth. And on that night, Jesus took a loaf of bread, broke it, like our world is broken, and he showed us the way to new life and hope by asking us to share our bread with one another in remembrance of his example. And so through the broken bread, we participate in and become the body of the Christ in the world. In like manner, Jesus took the cup filled with the fruit of the vine that sustains us and links us to one another in troubled times as well as good times. And Jesus asked us to drink of that same spirit of loving kindness and uniting harmony that was in him. So through the cup of blessing, we anticipate and participate in the changing and transformative life of the Christ in the world. May it be so. And now this is the time in our gathering where we extend the invitation to you to take part in the life of the church through the act of giving. If you feel so led as to share your resources with Chesterland UCC, you can do that online through the QR code that is found in your bulletin. You can snail mail it in, or you can place your offering in the bowl, the little basket over there on your way out today. And with that, would you please join me in prayer for our offering blessing? God of endings and beginnings, you are no stranger to change. You have seen this planet and its creatures through age after age, loving it in all its forms. Though we tremble at uncertainty, your care is steady, abiding, enduring. We give you thanks and pray for the faith to be patient in times of transition. May divine wisdom be our firm foundation. May it be so. Amen.
So 2 Thessalonians 3, somewhere around 6 through somewhere around 13, from the Message Bible. Radical. Our orders, backed up by the Master, Jesus, are to refuse to have anything to do with those among you who are lazy and refuse to work the way we taught you. Don't permit them to freeload on the rest. We showed you how to pull your weight when we were with you, so get on with it. We did not sit around on our hands expecting others to take care of us. In fact, we worked our fingers to the bone, up half the night moonlighting so you wouldn't be burdened with taking care of us. And it wasn't because we didn't have a right to your support. We did. We simply wanted to provide an example of diligence, hoping it would prove contagious. Don't you remember the rule we had when we lived with you? If you don't work, you don't eat. And now we're getting reports that a bunch of lazy good-for-nothings are streaming Netflix and scrolling through social media and are taking advantage of you. This must not be tolerated. We command them to get to work immediately. No excuses, no arguments. Earn their keep. Friends, don't slack off in doing your duty. And then I'm going to add from the King James. But treat them as brothers and not as enemies.
There's a reason why I thought of Mike for that. And this speech from the National Republican Convention will be available to you. And there are differences. And the reason I wanted the message read was because it is more dramatic. The core of the passage in other translations is the same. You don't work, you don't eat. That is actually a consistent line through all of the translations. But yes, the Eugene Peterson, who wrote the message, really gets flair into, and I don't use the message too often because it's not always necessarily from a scholarly standpoint accurate. But I love the drama of this particular passage from the message.
The note in the King James about there being disorderly.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
not being.
Yeah. Well, the last thing you want to do is ever refer to anything in the King James Bible. I'm just going to just say. So most of you here have heard me speak enough over the almost last year and a half, and I can't believe it's been a year and a half already. But most of you have heard me speak enough every week to get a fairly good idea where my passions as a clergy person lie. I've spoken on racial justice, queer issues, environmental justice, immigration, and women's rights, to name a few. And I speak on those issues not because they are popular or convenient or cool. I speak on those issues because I believe that justice for all, is dyed into the wool of the biblical canon. And that it is our duty as clergy to constantly and stubbornly steer the ship of the church directly into the heart of injustice and to never, ever, ever shut up about it. But just as there are topics that I regularly address, there are also topics that I consider to be sort of out of my wheelhouse or out of my comfort zone. And for me, one of those topics is money, giving, what we in the church call stewardship, the act of investing time and talents and resources into the life of one's spiritual community. And as will happen in most spiritual communities and most churches, some folks will commit to giving money to the church, and that's great. Some will volunteer and actively involve themselves in the life of the church, which is also great. Some might take a wait-and-see approach before making, too much of a commitment, which is great. And some of you will invest every bit of yourself into the life of your spiritual community, from finances to leadership roles to making snacks. But whatever your level of commitment, whether it's from dipping your toe into the pool to surfing the wave of involvement, it can't be said loud enough that it is all important. Do you give financially because you don't have a lot of volunteer time to offer? Awesome. Do you involve yourself because you don't really have any money to give? That's just as important. But why? Why is stewardship important? Why does it matter whether you involve yourself in church events or give financially to your spiritual community? Now, just as I've encouraged everyone over the past year and a half to engage with and examine why it is we believe what we believe theologically, we need to engage in the same amount of self-examination with regard to our actions within our church, within our spiritual community, both as individuals, but also as how we act collectively. Why do we give money? Why do we volunteer? Some folks might say that their sense of responsibility to be good stewards is born out of tradition. It's what they were taught by their family, and so that's what they do now. Sure, yeah, absolutely. Some might answer that their involvement grows out of a spiritual conviction, citing their commitment to God or to the community itself. For some, it might be, a little bit of both, somewhere in the middle. And some might answer, I don't do any of that. And of course, I would encourage those folks to just ask of themselves why as well. But this morning, I would like to offer one potential reason as to why stewardship is so important within a spiritual community, as well as potentially transformative. And I would like to use today's very difficult passage that Mike read so well from 2 Thessalonians to do that. And if you've made any effort to understand where I am coming from theologically since arriving here, then you shouldn't be surprised that I would want to tackle this very problematic passage from Scripture. I am not put off by the difficult passages in Scripture. Those are the ones that draw me, that I want to dive into, that I want to deconstruct and put in their cultural and historical context. Now, whenever I read or hear this passage, I hope maybe when you heard this, you cringed a little bit, because it makes me cringe, to say the least. It's a horrible screed against anyone who has ever been unemployed due to an inability to find work, or because of a disability, or job termination, or discrimination, or immigration status, or other circumstances. This is not a passage of comfort or hope. It is one of accusation and condemnation. And this passage has absolutely contributed to oppressive and sweeping narratives within the United States regarding work and unemployment and welfare and those who find themselves struggling economically. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the perception held by many Americans is that those who are unemployed or underemployed or living in poverty, they have nobody but themselves to blame for their predicament. And yet, as the facts as well as the historical record shows us, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to argue that poverty can be overcome by merit and hard work alone. There are people working 3 jobs who still can't afford the rent in their states. They did a study. No state in the United States can people afford to live on minimum wage. Not one state. But we think that the poor and unemployed are to blame for their situation. I remember years ago when I think Bush 2 was running for re-election, I think. Anyways, he was doing like a town hall. And this older woman starts talking about how she's working multiple jobs to just keep her head above water. This was someone like in their 60s. She's working multiple jobs to keep her head above water, that she's responsible for her grandchildren, because I think maybe her daughter died, I think. But anyways, it was a horrible story to hear from this woman. The former President Bush goes up, puts his arm around her and says, well, that's a uniquely American story. Thanks for sharing. No, that's not a uniquely American story. That's poverty is worldwide. But it's that attitude that, no, this isn't unusual. This is the American way. And the Bible is too often and too easily wielded as a weapon, religiously and politically, as justification for oppressive policies that punish people for living in poverty. Not policies that lift people out, but that continue to punish them for living in poverty, versus transforming the systems that make poverty an ever-present reality for so many people in this country and in this world. And so I view the work of deconstructing these passages in their cultural, historical context to be of utmost importance to us here in the 21st century. But also, how do we read this passage? And here's the important part. how do we read this passage in the larger context, the whole story of God? A context which more often than not, if you read the Bible from cover to cover, speaks regularly to the hungry being fed, speaks to those living in poverty having enough, speaks to those with disabilities having access to communities of belonging, and speaks to so many other forms of liberation from oppression, and above all, promotes justice. Today's passage from 2 Thessalonians actually advocates for a philosophy or a theology that is in opposition with the whole story of God. And as I've suggested in past messages, when we are confronted with scriptural passages that are at odds with the nature of the divine, with the nature of God, it's safe to say that we are dealing with a writing that is either a projection of our own modern cultural biases onto the text, or it's a misinterpretation, or it's simply a product of an author with their own prejudices and limitations that we have to address when we read them. We have to unpack them, we have to challenge them, or, and this might be shocking for some, or just rejected outright. We discussed this in our book study around the topic of Revelation, the book of Revelation, and how the entire book promotes a violent ideology of oppression that stands entirely in contradiction to the teachings of Jesus found within the Gospels. When you read Revelation and then go and read the Gospels, these are two radically different perspectives on Jesus and God. In Revelation, Jesus and God are violent and vengeful to anyone who does not believe what they think they should believe. But then we read the Gospels, and it's the opposite of that. So what do we do with it? I've told people it's okay to reject it. It's okay to not include it in your canon. Some are uncomfortable with that, and that's fine. But we have to make a decision when we come across these passages what we're going to do with them. Now, while debated among scholars, one perspective on this passage from 2 Thessalonians is that the community receiving this letter was under the impression that Jesus was about to return at any moment, or even possibly already had returned, and they just hadn't re-met him yet. They believed that the end of history, the writer and the readers would have believed that the end of history was already occurring and that God was just going to fix everything, righting the wrongs, bringing the peace, and manifesting justice. So in their minds, the world as they had understood it was ending and a new world was beginning. And so under those circumstances, it's not difficult to imagine why some people might have been refusing to work. Rather than waste time on labor that wouldn't matter anyway, why not prioritize other things? Why not prioritize family? Or taking that trip to Macedonia that you'd always been promising yourself you were gonna take? I don't know. But the argument can be made that perhaps they were prioritizing other things and work took a back seat. Why not, depending on one's position in the world, why not choose instead to just enjoy life instead of working if the end of times was imminent? I mean, if we found out in 2 weeks that a meteor was going to hit the earth and destroy it, would we go to work? I mean, I might need to, but in general, would we go to work? It's probably a good case that not many people would. Or if you were a bit more cynical about the return of Jesus, and you don't see the return of Jesus as a positive thing, why, quit work out of despair? I mean, it's the end of the world. Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. So in the context of good stewardship, This passage might be interpreted as a warning for those of us who fail to see the point in contributing to a spiritual community, whether that contribution is time or talents or resources. But none of us knows the future. But we continue to strive, we continue to toil, we continue to work, because those actions and those contributions, the work that we are able to do, creates hope for those who need hope the most. The impoverished, the oppressed, the marginalized. So the work that we do, we are then able to contribute to the lives of the people who need the most help. And if you're ever curious about the work that this church does from a social justice perspective, feeding locals and whatnot, you can sit in one of our social justice meetings. They meet next week. You can, a litany of things that the Social Justice Committee is in process of working on in the future, but also doing in the here and now. In today's moment of focus, theologian John Caputo wrote, I'm going to read it one more time, "There's nothing riskier than having commerce with the unknown, the unexpected, the unforeseen, with calling for the coming of what we cannot see coming. God's audacity is to throw the responsibility for God becoming God, on us, which is the height of audacity. The name God is the name of a call to which we are supposed to be the response. Without that response, the name is a dead letter. The real death of God is to ignore the call." Not ignoring the call. Taking on the responsibility for God becoming God. Responding in hope and through action to a future that is unseen and unknowable. This is our responsibility as stewards. And this is how I would challenge us to read our passage from 2 Thessalonians. Our responsibility to work in order to be able to give to marginalized audiences, versus reading it as a political or theological hammer to beat down on those existing on the economic fringes. In the United States, the idea that those who do not work should not get to eat is a painfully present cultural narrative. I mean, we are actually having presidential debates as to whether children have the right to a meal, a free meal at school. Children. And many of those against the idea of feeding children point to this passage from the Bible. And this horrible ideology and theology contributes to significant shame among those who are unemployed for whatever reason. It prioritizes production as the ultimate value of human life. In other words, you have no value unless you can produce something within the culture. And it has long contributed to keeping needed social services and policy changes from happening on the local, state, and national level. So many of us, myself included, so many of us have been taught to believe that anyone who isn't working is simply lazy or selfish or scamming the system. And those who do appear to be doing this, if we took the time to dig deeper, they are often manifesting a response to depression or trauma or hopelessness or other experiences that would make anyone desperate or fatigued. Because fatigue is different than laziness. Desperation is different than laziness. And whether laziness is even real in the first place is a psychologically debatable issue. So rather than a political or theological hammer, we have the opportunity to interpret this passage through the lens of a call to stewardship. In a world where 1 out of every 8 people in the United States lives below the poverty line. And 3.5 million people, half of which are children, experience homelessness in any given year. Stewardship becomes much more about, than just giving money or volunteering some time out of some kind of imposed obligation or guilt. Stewardship becomes the reality of God becoming God through our work, through our generosity, through our resources, through our hands and through our feet. We might read this passage as a call to which we are supposed to be the response when others are unable to respond, whether due to socioeconomic reasons, disabilities, mental health issues, or any number of factors. The core of stewardship is never forgetting that the heart of God is compassion, that the way of God is justice. This must be reflected not only in our understanding of Scripture, but in how and why we urge healthy and active stewardship. It's not so I can get paid more. It's so that we can affect change within our community. We cannot know everything there is to know about God, but we can know that we can know enough about God to know that God does not desire withholding food from the hungry. God does not desire that we withhold financial help for the unemployed or the underemployed. God does not desire that we withhold housing from homeless people. You know what? Quick side note. I wasn't going to talk about this, but this just makes me so angry. We know, scientifically, we've done studies. Some cities and states have actually enacted giving homeless people a house with no preconditions, no payments to be made. Here's a house or an apartment. And what they have found, and what we have found in studies, is that that actually helps the economy. It cuts down on homelessness. More often than not, those individuals manage to keep that home. And yet, we continue to act like if you're homeless, you have to work. You have to earn the right to be housed. And from a capitalist perspective, that makes sense. But if we are genuinely concerned about cutting down on homelessness, if we're genuinely concerned about cutting down on poverty, we know how to do it. We've proven how it works. We just have chosen to not have the will to do it. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now. So anyways, this passage from 2 Thessalonians challenges us in our context. And it asks us to return through stewardship to what we know about God, about the kind of community God calls us to build together, and about the care for bodies, hungry bodies, weary bodies, anxious bodies, bodies that are overworked, and bodies that are underemployed. That is always at the heart of the divine Spirit. And it challenges those of us who are able to be the hands and the feet of God, to not grow weary in the stewardship of our time and resources, and to embrace the very real responsibility for God becoming God and for manifesting hope in a world and in a people with so very little hope left. May it be so.
the end of the storm, there's a golden sky, the sweet silver song of the lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. You were known before birth, woven deep in the earth. You were formed from star-bursting place. You were fearfully, wonderfully made. Yes, you are fearfully, wonderfully made. You belong, you are redeemed, loved by God, God is well pleased. But God has ordained, you are fearfully, wonderfully made. Yes, you are fearfully, wonderfully made. When you walk through the flame, God is there calling your name. God has said, do not be afraid. You are fearfully, wonderfully made. Yes, you are fearfully, wonderfully made.
Friends, let us not grow weary in being responsible stewards of our time, our resources, in loving one another, in casting our lot with the oppressed, or in caring for the world around us. Today and always, may we uphold one another as God upholds us. In the company of the Divine Spirit, go in peace. Have a wonderful week. Please stay for food. Thank you.